Do you think life is tough now? What if your retirement plan involved working until your back gave out, or hoping your kids remembered you? What if reaching the age of 50 was a grand achievement, and every day after that felt like living on borrowed time? This was the harsh reality for the elderly living in the medieval period, roughly between 500 AD and 1500 AD. Number 10. Vulnerability to physical decline and relentless manual labor. Life in the medieval era, particularly for the vast majority of people who toiled on the land, was defined by relentless physical exertion from a young age. A medieval peasant, whether a serf bound to the land or a free tenant, began their working life almost as soon as they could walk, performing small tasks and gradually taking on heavier duties as they grew. The tools were rudimentary, often made of wood and iron, and every task from plowing fields to harvesting crops, from grinding grain to tending livestock, demanded immense muscular strength and endurance. A typical workday stretched from dawn until dusk, dictated by the available daylight and the seasonal demands of agriculture. A person's body was their primary asset, their means of survival, and their output directly linked to the amount of food on their table and the security of their tenure. As years passed, the cumulative effect of this unceasing labor began to take its toll. The elderly in the medieval world faced a stark reality where their physical decline directly threatened their ability to survive. Joints stiffened. A common ailment like osteoarthritis, known simply as aches or rheums at the time, made bending, lifting, and carrying excruciatingly painful. The spine, constantly burdened by heavy loads and repetitive motions like scything or hoeing, would become hunched and rigid. Many elderly individuals would suffer from chronic back pain, a persistent companion that made even simple movements a struggle. The constant exposure to the elements, working in damp fields in cold weather, exacerbated these conditions, leading to persistent chills and deeper aches in the bones. Eyesight, without the benefit of glasses or corrective lenses, deteriorated with age, making tasks like weaving, mending clothes, or even distinguishing ripe crops from weeds much harder. Night blindness, caused by vitamin deficiencies, was common, making movement after dark perilous. Hearing loss, also a natural part of aging, compounded the isolation many older individuals felt, making communication difficult and adding to the general sense of being less capable. Teeth, worn down by a coarse diet, often containing grit from the milling process, and plagued by infections due to poor hygiene, would often be lost, impacting the ability to chew food properly and leading to further nutritional deficiency. The very structure of medieval society offered little respite. There was no concept of retirement in the modern sense. Unless one belonged to the tiny fraction of the aristocracy or wealthy merchant class, work was not an option but a necessity. A peasant, regardless of age, was expected to contribute to the household economy as long as they were physically able. If an elderly person could no longer perform the heavy work of plowing or sowing, they might be relegated to lighter tasks such as weeding, guarding livestock, spinning wool, or caring for grandchildren. However, even these lighter tasks could be physically demanding for someone whose body was breaking down. For example, spinning wool was a continuous, repetitive motion that could still strain tired hands and wrists. Carrying water from a well or collecting firewood remained essential, arduous chores. The decline in physical capacity often meant a decline in personal autonomy and social standing within the household. If an elderly man or woman could no longer pull their weight, they risked becoming a burden, which could lead to a reduction in their portion of food or even a loss of their place at the hearth. This physical deterioration was not just a personal struggle. It was a societal challenge as communities grappled with how to support those who could no longer contribute physically in a world where physical contribution was paramount. Records from manorial courts sometimes show agreements where a younger family member or a landlord would provide for an elderly individual in exchange for their land or future labor, but these arrangements often stipulated what level of work the elderly person was still expected to perform. Their physical ability was their worth, and when that faded, so did their security. Number 9. High mortality rates and the meaning of old. The definition of elderly in the medieval period was vastly different from our understanding today. Life expectancy was strikingly low, not because people necessarily aged faster, but because so many individuals died young, due to disease, famine, childbirth, and conflict. While average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 35 years, through most of the medieval period, this figure is heavily skewed by high infant and child mortality rates. If a person managed to survive the perils of childhood and adolescence, their chances of living longer improved somewhat, but reaching what we consider a ripe old age was an exceptional feat. For a medieval person, surviving into their 40s or 50s meant they had already overcome numerous life-threatening challenges. Someone in their late 40s or early 50s was often considered old by their contemporaries. A person reaching 60 or 70 was truly rare, a venerable figure who had witnessed many generations and much change. Historical records such as parish registers or monastic obituaries occasionally mention individuals living into their 70s or 80s, but these were outliers, typically members of the clergy or nobility who had some access to better nutrition, less strenuous physical labor, and perhaps a slightly cleaner environment within monastic walls or castle estates. For the vast peasant population, such longevity was a dream. The high mortality rates among the elderly, even those who survived past childhood, were largely due to the cumulative effects of a lifetime of hard labor, poor nutrition, and chronic exposure to disease. Their bodies, already weakened by repeated infections and a lack of proper medical care, were less resilient to new ailments. Simple infections, which today are easily treatable with antibiotics, could be fatal. A persistent cough could turn into pneumonia. A minor cut could lead to a deadly infection, and a bout of dysentery could quickly dehydrate and kill. The lack of robust immune systems developed in an age before modern sanitation and hygiene meant that the elderly were particularly vulnerable to recurring outbreaks of illness. The bubonic plague or Black Death, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, is perhaps the most devastating example. While it affected all age groups, the elderly and those with compromised health were among the most susceptible and had the lowest chances of recovery. Chronic conditions like heart disease, kidney ailments, or advanced arthritis, which are managed for decades in modern medicine, were untreatable and often led to early demise. There was no concept of geriatric care, no specialized knowledge about the diseases that specifically affected older bodies, and no way to manage chronic pain beyond rudimentary herbal remedies or spiritual consolation. Furthermore, the general hardships of medieval life disproportionately affected the elderly. During times of famine, which were frequent due to unpredictable weather and rudimentary agricultural techniques, the elderly were often the first to succumb to starvation or related illnesses. When food was scarce, the younger, stronger members of a family were often predunitized, as they were seen as essential for future labor and survival. Similarly, during periods of conflict or raids, the elderly, being less mobile and less able to defend themselves, were at greater risk of violence, displacement, or neglect. The very concept of a long life was thus tinged with the constant specter of death. For the medieval elderly, every day survived was a victory against overwhelming odds. Their survival was a testament to their individual resilience, a strong constitution, and perhaps a touch of good fortune. It meant living through multiple waves of disease, surviving harsh winters, enduring periods of hunger, and continuing to contribute physically in a world that offered little quarter to those whose strength began to wane. This high mortality rate shaped societal expectations, making old age a relatively young chronological age and imbuing those who reached it with a unique, if often precarious, status. Number 8. Poverty and the absence of a social safety net. For the vast majority of the elderly in medieval society, poverty was an ever-present threat, a shadow that lengthened with every passing year. Unlike today, there was no concept of a state-sponsored pension, no national healthcare system, and no widespread social welfare programs designed to support the aged. The medieval economy was primarily agrarian, and wealth was directly tied to land ownership or the ability to work the land. For the elderly who no longer possessed the strength for strenuous labor, their economic value diminished significantly, often leading to destitution. The feudal system, which dominated much of Europe, dictated that peasants, whether serfs or free tenants, paid rents or labor services to their lords in exchange for the right to cultivate a plot of land. This arrangement often continued until death. But what happened when a peasant became too frail to work their allotted strips of land? Their ability to pay rent in kind or labor services would cease, placing them in a precarious position. Some lords might have allowed an elderly tenant to retain a smaller cottage or a tiny patch of garden in exchange for light duties or a token payment, but this was not guaranteed. Often, an elderly peasant would have to surrender their land to a younger family member or a new tenant in exchange for a promise of care. These corrodi agreements, as they were sometimes called, were essentially private social contracts, but their enforcement depended entirely on the goodwill and economic stability of the younger generation. Family was the primary, and often the only, social safety net available to the medieval elderly. It was generally expected that children would care for their aging parents. This was not merely a matter of filial piety. It was an economic necessity. Older family members, even if physically diminished, could still contribute in various ways: childcare, tending small garden plots, mending clothes, preparing food, or sharing their accumulated wisdom and knowledge of farming cycles or local remedies. However, if a family was themselves struggling with poverty, a poor harvest, or illness, the burden of an aging parent could be immense. If children died before their parents, or if they moved away, the elderly were left with no recourse. Charity provided some limited relief, but it was far from comprehensive. The church, particularly monasteries and some cathedrals, operated almshouses, which were charitable institutions, offering shelter, food, and basic care for the poor and infirm. These institutions were usually few and far between, however, and could only accommodate a tiny fraction of the needy elderly. Entry was often competitive, requiring a patron or a demonstrated history of piety, and conditions within them, while better than destitution, were still austere. Mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans also engaged in charitable work, begging for alms to distribute to the poor, including the elderly. Yet this was inconsistent and dependent on the generosity of the community. Beggars were a common sight in medieval towns and villages, and many of them were elderly individuals who had no family or other means of support. They relied on the goodwill of passers-by or the occasional handout from a wealthy household. Laws against vagrancy, particularly in the later Middle Ages, sometimes made their existence even more perilous, threatening them with punishment or forced labor. The reality was that many elderly individuals faced the stark choice between continuing to work until their bodies gave out entirely, becoming dependent on relatives who might not be willing or able to provide, or resorting to begging. Without a state-sponsored safety net, their economic security was almost entirely contingent on their continued ability to labor or the strength of their family ties. This vulnerability to poverty meant that a life of quiet dignity in old age was a luxury reserved for the very few, while for the majority it was a constant struggle against destitution. Their lack of financial independence and institutional support meant that old age was not a period of rest, but a period of profound economic insecurity. Number 7. Inadequate medical care and primitive health understanding. The state of medical knowledge and available health care in the medieval period was rudimentary, to say the least. For the elderly, whose bodies were already weakened by a lifetime of toil and exposure, this lack of sophisticated medical understanding and treatment options meant that aging was often synonymous with increasing pain, disability, and a slow decline with little hope of relief. There was no specialized field of geriatrics, no understanding of age-related diseases beyond general observations, and no concept of preventative care for older individuals. Medieval medicine was heavily influenced by ancient Greek and Roman theories, particularly the humoral theory, which posited that the body was made up of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness resulted from an imbalance of these. Treatments, therefore, often involved methods like bloodletting, purging, or cupping, which were designed to restore humoral balance. While these practices might have offered psychological comfort, they often did little to alleviate actual ailments, and could even weaken an already frail, elderly person. For specific conditions common in old age, such as arthritis, cataracts, or heart problems, these treatments were largely ineffective. Chronic pain, especially from worn joints and muscles, was a common complaint among the elderly. Remedies often involved herbal poultices, warm compresses, or concoctions made from plants like willow bark, a natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, but without consistent dosage or purity. While some herbal remedies might have provided minor relief, they could not halt the progression of degenerative diseases. For more severe pain, opium or alcohol might have been used, but these carried their own risks of dependency and harmful side effects. Surgical practices were incredibly primitive and dangerous, without antiseptics or anesthesia. Even minor procedures carried a high risk of infection and excruciating pain. Broken bones, common from falls among the elderly, might be set, but often healed poorly, leaving lasting deformities or disabilities. Conditions like cataracts, which could cause blindness, were sometimes attempted to be couched, a crude procedure to dislodge the lens, but this often resulted in blindness or severe infection. Dental care was virtually non-existent beyond pulling aching teeth, leading to widespread tooth loss, gum disease, and the inability to chew properly, which further impacted nutrition. Access to even this basic, often ineffective medical care was also a significant challenge. Qualified physicians who had studied at universities were few in number and primarily served the wealthy nobility and urban elite. For the vast majority of the rural elderly, medical care came from local healers, barber surgeons, apothecaries, or members of the clergy. Village healers often relied on a mix of folk remedies, superstition, and practical experience. Barber surgeons performed bloodletting, tooth extractions, and minor surgical procedures, but their understanding of anatomy and hygiene was limited. Monasteries sometimes offered infirmaries, providing basic nursing care and herbal treatments, but their capacity was limited and primarily served their own communities or local populations. Sanitation was poor across the board, even in urban centers, and basic hygiene was not well understood. This meant that infections were rampant, wounds easily festered, and diseases spread quickly. The elderly, with weaker immune systems, were particularly susceptible to recurring bouts of illness, from common colds that could turn into fatal pneumonia to parasitic infections that caused chronic digestive issues. Furthermore, there was a spiritual dimension to illness. Sickness was often seen as divine punishment or a trial from God. This perspective, while offering spiritual solace, sometimes discouraged practical medical intervention, with prayer and repentance considered as important or even more important than physical treatment. For the medieval, elderly aging was not just a natural process. It was a journey through increasing physical hardship, endured with minimal medical understanding or effective relief, culminating in a death often hastened by ailments that are now easily managed. Number 6. Harsh living conditions and environmental hazards. The medieval elderly faced daily challenges stemming from the extremely harsh and often unsanitary living conditions prevalent across Europe. Homes, particularly for the peasant majority, offered little comfort or protection from the elements, and the immediate environment presented numerous health hazards that disproportionately affected older, frailer bodies. Most medieval dwellings were small, single-room structures, often made of wattle and daub timber or stone with thatched roofs. They lacked proper ventilation. Windows were small and often unglazed, and floors were typically made of packed earth. Heating came from an open hearth in the center of the room, with smoke often escaping through a hole in the roof or simply filling the living space. The constant presence of smoke from wood fires led to chronic respiratory problems, such as bronchitis and emphysema, which would have been particularly debilitating for the elderly, whose lungs were already weaker. Coughing and shortness of breath would have been daily struggles. Cold and dampness were pervasive threats, winters were brutal, and insulation was minimal. The elderly, with poor circulation and reduced body fat, were highly susceptible to hypothermia and severe chills. Sleeping on straw mattresses on the floor, often shared with family members and even livestock in some peasant homes, offered little warmth. The damp conditions also exacerbated joint pain and arthritis, making movement difficult and painful. Records from the period occasionally mention rheums and agues, which were terms for chronic aches and fevers, often linked to exposure and damp living. Hygiene was a foreign concept by modern standards. Water sources were often contaminated, leading to widespread waterborne diseases like dysentery and cholera, which could rapidly dehydrate and kill an elderly person. Latrines, if they existed at all, were basic pits, and waste disposal was often haphazard, leading to the accumulation of filth and the proliferation of vermin. Rats, mice, and insects were common household pests, carrying diseases like the plague and various fevers. Fleas and lice were endemic, causing constant itching and transmitting bacterial infections. The elderly, with less robust immune systems, were more vulnerable to these recurring infections. Food storage was rudimentary, leading to spoilage and contamination. Grains and other foodstuffs were often infested with insects or molds, and consuming them could lead to digestive illnesses. Without refrigeration, meat and dairy products quickly spoiled, especially in warmer months. The diet itself, often lacking in fresh produce, meant that vitamin deficiencies were common, further weakening the body's resistance to illness and contributing to a range of ailments from poor vision to scurvy. The physical environment outside the home also posed significant risks. Roads were unpaved and uneven, often muddy or icy, making travel treacherous for those with mobility issues. Falls were common and could lead to serious injuries like broken bones, which, as mentioned, were difficult to treat and could lead to permanent disability or death. Natural disasters, such as floods, droughts, or severe storms, would devastate communities, destroying homes and crops and leaving the elderly, who were less able to flee or rebuild, particularly vulnerable to displacement, hunger, and exposure. The cumulative effect of these harsh living conditions meant that the medieval elderly were constantly battling their environment. The cold gnawed at their bones, the smoke choked their lungs, and the lack of sanitation exposed them to a barrage of diseases. There were no public health initiatives, no building codes, and little understanding of germ theory. Survival in such an environment required immense resilience, and for the elderly, it was a daily struggle simply to maintain warmth, cleanliness, and protection from the elements, making their decline not just a matter of age, but a direct consequence of their unrelenting surroundings. Number 5. Vulnerability to famine and disease. The medieval period was characterized by frequent and devastating cycles of famine and epidemic disease. events that disproportionately affected the elderly and highlighted their extreme vulnerability. Unlike modern societies with food reserves and advanced medical systems, medieval communities lived on the knife edge of survival. And when disaster struck, the aged were often among the first casualties. Famine was a recurring specter. Agricultural techniques were rudimentary, heavily dependent on favorable weather conditions. A prolonged drought, excessive rainfall, or a severe winter could lead to catastrophic crop failures. When harvests failed, food prices soared, and food became scarce. For the peasant population, who lived hand to mouth, this meant widespread hunger. The elderly, with their already diminished physical strength and often reduced social standing within households, were frequently the first to suffer from malnutrition and starvation. In times of extreme scarcity, tough decisions had to be made about who received the limited food supply, and tragically, the youngest, infants and small children, and the oldest, were often at the highest risk of being overlooked as the able-bodied laborers were prioritized for the family's future survival. Accounts from monastic chronicles and local records often describe emaciated bodies and a sharp rise in deaths during years of famine. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for instance, devastated populations across Europe, and the elderly were among the most susceptible to its ravages. Concurrent with famine, or sometimes independently, came waves of epidemic diseases. With poor sanitation, limited understanding of contagion, and dense living conditions in towns and villages, diseases spread rapidly and indiscriminately. The most notorious example is the Black Death, which began in the mid-14th century and wiped out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population. While the plague affected all age groups, the elderly, whose immune systems were already weakened by a lifetime of infections and nutritional deficiencies, were particularly vulnerable. They often had lower resistance to the bacillus and were less likely to recover once infected. Chronic illnesses and the general frailty of old age made them easier targets for such virulent diseases. Beyond the plague, numerous other diseases regularly swept through medieval communities. Influenza, often called sweating sickness, tuberculosis, dysentery, smallpox, and various fevers. For the elderly, a common cold could quickly escalate into fatal pneumonia. Diarrheal diseases caused by contaminated water or food led to rapid dehydration and death. Tuberculosis, a chronic wasting disease, was endemic and particularly cruel to the elderly, slowly consuming their strength. Without antibiotics or even basic understanding of hygiene, there was little defense. The impact of these twin threats extended beyond direct mortality. Famine weakened survivors, making them more susceptible to subsequent outbreaks of disease. Disease, in turn, disrupted agricultural labor, leading to future food shortages. For the elderly, this cycle meant a life lived under constant threat. Even if they survived one crisis, their resilience was diminished, making the next one even harder to overcome. The community structures, while providing some local support, could not cope with widespread systemic failures of food supply or overwhelming epidemics. The elderly were often left without family support if their younger kin succumbed to disease or famine, further isolating them and reducing their chances of survival. Their vulnerability to these larger ecological and epidemiological forces bursts the precariousness of life in old age during the medieval period, where a single bad harvest or a new sickness could quickly spell the end. Number 4. Lack of social status and respect, or the burden of age. While some elderly individuals in medieval society might have commanded respect due to their wisdom and experience, many others faced a decline in social status, becoming burdens rather than revered figures, especially if they were poor or infirm. This was a complex aspect of aging, varying significantly based on social class, gender, and individual circumstances. In a hierarchical society, where physical prowess and productive labor were highly valued, the elderly, particularly those from the peasant classes whose physical capabilities waned, often found their status diminishing. They could no longer contribute as much to the demanding agricultural economy, and their reliance on younger family members or charity could lead to them being viewed as a drain on resources. Manorial records and wills sometimes show older peasants surrendering their land in exchange for a korodi, a promise of food, shelter, and basic care from their children or a new tenant. While these agreements provided security, they also formalized a shift in power dynamics, where the elderly person became dependent rather than independent. If these agreements were broken, which was not uncommon, the elderly person had little recourse and could be left destitute. For elderly women, the situation could be particularly challenging. While some women, especially widows who managed to retain property, might have gained a degree of independence and authority, those without resources faced immense hardship. An elderly woman no longer able to perform strenuous tasks like childbearing, heavy fieldwork, or extensive textile production might find her role in the household marginalized. She might be relegated to childcare or simple domestic tasks, or worse, become entirely dependent on charity or the goodwill of her children. There are historical accounts of elderly women being accused of witchcraft, sometimes simply because they were poor, eccentric, or had no family to protect them, reflecting a darker side of societal attitudes towards marginalized older women. The reverence for wisdom and experience was certainly present, especially for elders who possessed specialized knowledge, such as master craftsmen, experienced midwives, or those who remembered historical events or local customs. These individuals might serve as advisors or storytellers. Holding a valued position in the community, however, this respect was often conditional. A wise elder who could still contribute meaningfully, even if not physically, would be more valued than one who was entirely infirm and dependent. For the illiterate majority, oral tradition was key, and elders played a vital role in passing down stories, skills, and knowledge, giving them a certain authority. However, the reality for many was that their diminished physical capacity made them a perceived burden. This perception was exacerbated during times of scarcity, when families struggled to feed even themselves. The shame of being a burden, or the fear of outright abandonment, was a very real psychological challenge for the elderly. While Christian teachings emphasized charity and respect for elders, the practical realities of survival in a harsh world often overrode these ideals. Almshouses run by monasteries or wealthy patrons offered a glimmer of hope for the truly destitute elderly, but their capacity was limited. The absence of a formalized system of retirement or social welfare meant that an individual's social status was closely tied to their productive capacity. As that capacity waned with age, so too often did their standing in the community and even within their own family. This vulnerability to social devaluation, becoming a burden rather than a venerable elder, was a deeply personal challenge that added to the already immense physical and economic struggles of old age in the medieval period. Number 3, dependence on family and the risk of abandonment. For the vast majority of the medieval elderly, dependence on their family was not merely a social norm but an absolute necessity for survival. With no pensions, state benefits, or widespread institutional care, the family unit was the primary and often sole source of support. However, this dependence came with inherent risks, including the grim possibility of neglect or outright abandonment, particularly in times of hardship. The medieval household was typically multi-generational, with adult children, their spouses, and grandchildren living together under one roof, or at least in very close proximity within the same village. This arrangement was economically driven. An elderly parent, even if no longer capable of heavy labor, could still contribute by performing lighter tasks such as childcare, mending clothes, preparing meals, fetching water, or spinning wool. Their accumulated knowledge of farming techniques, local customs, or even herbal remedies also held value. In return for these contributions, and out of a sense of filial duty rooted in both custom and religious teaching, the elderly were provided with food, shelter, and care. Wills and property transfers often included clauses stipulating that children or heirs were obligated to provide for aging parents. These were known as corrodi agreements, where land or property was exchanged for a lifetime of maintenance. However, the success of this system hinged entirely on the family's economic stability and moral fortitude. If a family faced a string of bad harvests, illness, or death of a key working member, their ability to support an additional, less productive mouth became severely strained. In such circumstances, the elderly might find their portions of food reduced, their living conditions deteriorate, or their care become neglectful. For example, during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, chronicles report instances where families, desperate to survive, were forced to make impossible choices, sometimes leading to the abandonment of their elderly relatives. The death of adult children, especially before their parents, was another devastating blow. Without direct heirs or a close network of kin, an elderly person could suddenly find themselves entirely alone and without support. This was a common fear, given the high mortality rates across all age groups. An elderly widow or widower who had outlived their children faced a particularly bleak future, often resorting to begging or hoping for the limited charity of the church or wealthier individuals. While most medieval societies emphasized filial piety and religious teachings often condemned the abandonment of parents, the practical realities could be harsh. There were no legal mechanisms to enforce care beyond local custom or specific contractual agreements. A disobedient or struggling child could simply cease providing for their parent, leaving the elderly person in dire straits. Court records from later medieval periods occasionally show cases where elderly parents sued their children for failing to uphold promises of care, indicating that such neglect was a real, though likely underreported problem. The psychological toll of this dependence, coupled with the ever-present threat of neglect or abandonment, must have been immense. The elderly were often aware that their very survival relied on the goodwill and economic success of their children. This created a profound sense of vulnerability, where their future was not in their own hands but contingent on the lives and decisions of others. The family was a lifeline, but it was a lifeline that could fray, leaving the elderly adrift in a world with little compassion for those who could no longer contribute. Number 2. Extreme lack of personal hygiene and sanitation. One of the most persistent and pervasive daily challenges for the medieval elderly was living in an environment utterly devoid of modern standards of personal hygiene and sanitation. This absence profoundly impacted their health, comfort, and overall quality of life, exacerbating the effects of aging and increasing their vulnerability to a constant barrage of diseases. Bathing was not a regular practice for most people in the medieval period, particularly for the peasantry. While public bathhouses existed in some larger towns, especially in the early medieval period and then revived in the later centuries, they were often associated with vice or became scarce after various outbreaks of disease. For the vast majority, personal cleansing involved occasional washes with cold water. Soap, as we understand it today, was either rudimentary or expensive, and its use was not widespread. This meant that bodies often harbored dirt, grime, and body odors. For the elderly, with limited mobility and potentially infirmity, even these basic washes would have been difficult to perform, leading to even poorer personal hygiene. Clothing, often made of coarse wool or linen, was rarely washed. Clothes were worn for extended periods, accumulating sweat, dirt, and body oils. The lack of clean clothing contributed to skin irritation, sores, and provided a breeding ground for parasites. Fleas and lice were endemic, causing constant itching, skin infections, and acting as vectors for diseases like typhus, which was devastating especially to the elderly. Records of outbreaks often describe a fever with spots, consistent with typhus. The living environment was equally unhygienic. Most peasant homes had earth floors which were impossible to truly clean and accumulated filth. Animal waste from livestock sharing living spaces was common. Food waste was often discarded carelessly, attracting rats and other vermin. These pests carried diseases and contaminated food supplies. A rat problem was not just an annoyance, it was a serious health threat, particularly for the elderly who might be less able to deter them or clean up after them. Human waste disposal was abysmal. Latrines were often rudimentary pits or simply outdoor areas. There were no sewage systems in most medieval settlements. Excrement was often thrown into streets, rivers, or open fields, contaminating water sources and spreading diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. The elderly with weakened digestive systems were particularly susceptible to severe dehydration and death from such waterborne illnesses. Chronicles often mention fluxes and bloody stools, which point to widespread diarrheal diseases. Water sources themselves were often contaminated. Wells were frequently dug close to sources of contamination, and rivers that served as drinking water were also used for waste disposal. Boiling water was not a common practice, and even if it was, the fuel required was often too precious. This reliance on unsafe water meant that stomach ailments and parasitic infections were a constant threat, slowly debilitating the elderly. Furthermore, medical practices themselves often lacked hygiene. Barber surgeons performed operations without sterilizing instruments or washing their hands. Midwives and healers worked with little understanding of germ transmission. This meant that infections were rampant, and even a minor cut or wound could quickly become gangrenous and fatal, especially for an elderly person whose immune system was already compromised. The cumulative effect of this extreme lack of personal hygiene and public sanitation meant that the medieval elderly lived in a perpetual state of exposure to pathogens. Their bodies were constantly battling infections, often unseen, slowly draining their energy and resilience. There was no escaping the filth, the parasites, or the contaminated environment. This daily reality of unhygienic conditions was not just uncomfortable. It was a major contributing factor to the high morbidity and mortality rates among the elderly, making their later years a constant battle against disease in a world without proper cleanliness. Number 1. Dietary deficiencies and poor nutrition. The daily diet of the medieval elderly, particularly for the vast majority of the population who were peasants, was characterized by stark monotony, seasonal scarcity, and pervasive nutritional deficiencies. This poor nutrition was not merely uncomfortable, it directly undermined their health, weakened their bodies, and accelerated the effects of aging, making them more vulnerable to disease and less able to perform essential tasks. The staple diet for most medieval peasants consisted primarily of grain, usually rye or barley, baked into bread or made into pottage, a thick stew. This was supplemented by vegetables from their garden plots, such as peas, beans, onions, and cabbage when in season. Meat was a luxury, rarely consumed by the poor, perhaps only on feast days or when a small animal was slaughtered. Dairy products, like cheese or milk, were also limited. Fish was eaten more commonly, especially on fast days mandated by the church. Fruit was seasonal and perishable. This diet, while providing caloric energy, was often woefully lacking in essential nutrients. Without consistent access to fresh fruits and vegetables, vitamin deficiencies were rampant. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, led to bleeding gums, loose teeth, joint pain, and extreme fatigue, all conditions that would have been particularly debilitating for the elderly. Night blindness, a symptom of vitamin A deficiency, made movement in dim light dangerous, and impaired vision in general was a common problem. Rickets, caused by vitamin D deficiency, primarily affected children but could manifest as bone deformities and weakness in adults, including the elderly. Protein intake was often insufficient, especially for those who could not afford meat or fish regularly. This led to muscle wasting and general weakness, making the physical demands of medieval life even harder to bear for older individuals. The coarse grains also caused digestive issues and, combined with a lack of dental care, made eating difficult. Many elderly people would have suffered from missing teeth or infected gums, further limiting their ability to chew and digest the coarse, often gritty bread, which itself contained grit from primitive milling processes, leading to further dental wear. This meant that, even when food was available, their ability to consume and benefit from it was compromised, leading to further malnutrition. Seasonal hunger was a predictable challenge. After the harvest, food might be relatively plentiful, but as winter deepened and supplies dwindled, the lean months before the next harvest brought acute scarcity. Food spoilage, due to the absence of refrigeration, meant that fresh produce was only available for a short time. Dried, salted, or smoked foods were common, but these preservation methods could reduce nutrient content. For the elderly, with diminished energy reserves and a less robust immune system, these periods of scarcity were particularly perilous. They might receive smaller portions or suffer more severely from malnutrition than younger, more productive family members. Furthermore, the quality of available food was often poor. Grains could be contaminated with ergot, a fungus that caused a hallucinogenic and often deadly illness known as St. Anthony's fire, which would have been devastating for an older body. Unclean cooking practices and contaminated water sources also meant that foodborne illnesses were common, leading to bouts of dysentery and other digestive upsets that further depleted the body's resources. The constant struggle to acquire sufficient and nutritious food meant that the medieval elderly often lived with chronic hunger and malnutrition. This did not just make them feel weak, it fundamentally compromised their immune systems, leaving them susceptible to every passing disease. It slowed their healing from injuries, exacerbated chronic conditions like arthritis, and ultimately shortened their already precarious lifespans. Their daily life was a relentless pursuit of enough sustenance to simply survive without the benefit of a varied or balanced diet to truly sustain their aging bodies.